Southeast Asian Development, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In the global economic downturn, even the once vibrant economies of Asia felt the pinch. A recent forecast by the Asia Development Bank predicted that Southeast Asia's growth in 2009 will fall to just 0.7%, down from 4.3% in 2008. To help us explore the development challenges facing Southeast Asia in light of the current economic malaise, we're joined by two guests with recent experience in the region. The vaguely familiar Rob Ricigliano is Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. He recently traveled to Cambodia to help facilitate a U.S. government interagency country assessment involving USAID and the Departments of State and Defense. Jeff Browne is president of Vietnamics, a consulting firm that facilitates partnerships between the U.S. and Vietnamese businesses and other organizations. He formerly served as president of the Public Policy Forum, a nonpartisan regional think tank in southeastern Wisconsin. Well, welcome both of you to International Focus.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start with really a basic question of what we mean by development in the context of Southeast Asia. And Rob, maybe you want to start?
As a global comparator, I think a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, are at a general level of development, standard of living, even in rural areas, that's above what you would say find in some of the worst parts of rural Africa, where people really are struggling just to get by on basic necessities. So a lot of Cambodia, even in the rural areas which are relatively very poor, life is fairly stable. And then in the cities, you'll find, I think, a level of development that's generally beyond what you'll see in most developing countries outside the region, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So as a baseline, it's relatively well off, and in an absolute sense, and certainly by our standards, has a very, very long way to go in terms of education, economic development, agricultural production, development of the government, human rights, and things like that. So on lots of those scales, both the social and the economic and the political scales, there's a long way to go.
Jeff, Vietnam, same story?
Well, yeah, it's probably partly because I'm in the business of business consulting, but when I think of development, I think of opportunity. And Southeast Asia is a region. I think most people don't realize it's 600 million people, or very close to that entire region, and that's larger than North America. It is on a scale with Europe. And most people don't have that perception about the scope of Southeast Asia because it's in the shadow of China and India. And of course, for most of human history, Southeast Asia has been out of sight, out of mind on a global scale. So what I see is development means an opportunity in Southeast Asia to really, in this century, make its mark, to rise on a global scale in terms of economic development.
And you mentioned world history. And there will be those that will, from the region, who will say, especially in Cambodia, the center of the large Buddhist kingdoms, that this was civilization. I mean, at one point. So I think in a lot of ways that this image is in their heads of what was, and maybe I don't think they're a long way from getting there again. But there is that pride that's beginning to take hold in the region after many years when there wasn't that pride at all.
Absolutely.
I think in the younger generation, especially, you're starting to see this real pride in being Cambodian, and maybe it's the same in Vietnam.
Yes, pride, and when it comes to Vietnam, is a very good word to use. Again, the perception I get when I talk to people, in business leaders, especially of my generation, which people who came of age during the Vietnam War, they have this perception of Vietnam as being sort of small and insignificant and jungle, full of jungle and so forth. The reality is Vietnam is the 13th largest country in the world by population. It is on the scale in terms of its geography about the size of Japan. it's a very large, growing, dynamic country that has, in my view, a terrific future.
Well, speaking of development and development policy, I know Vietnam in particular has taken a bit of a sharp turn in their approach to development. So maybe both of you would take a opportunity to talk about what kinds of models for development are really being employed right now.
Well, I can speak on the Vietnamese side. There is a great deal of global interest in helping Vietnam grow its economy and to join the world community of developing economies. And both the NGO sector and all of the governmental agencies are very deeply involved in Vietnam. Vietnam, in return or in exchange for that, has been making some major changes in the way it controls its economy, the way it's been opening its economy to global investment and free market enterprise, and that's been the biggest development in Vietnam over the past really 20 years.
I think Cambodia is a bit of a different story in that way, and I think I mean I may be wrong, Jeff. My perception of Vietnam is that they're closer to the Asian tiger examples of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and feeling like that can happen there. Cambodia, because of its history, and it was really through this devastating genocide in '75 to '79 after the Vietnam War, and then a period of internal warfare until Vietnam came in, or Vietnam came in during that time, and there's this period of internal warfare. Eventually there's stability, but the current seeding of Cambodia, if you will, didn't really start until the mid to late '90s. And during that time, their budget basically came from the international community, and it's still about 50% or more of their governmental expenditures on things like development are from the international community. So it's had a positive effect. Obviously, without that, Cambodia would be in a much worse position. On the other hand, it's made the Cambodians themselves very reactive to international initiatives. So there is not necessarily a Cambodian sort of approach to development, because they are dealing with multiple models of development. So the Japanese, say, have a model, and the Europeans have a model, and the Canadians have a model, and the Americans have a model. And they're, of course, wanting to appeal to those folks because they want the money and they need the money. On the other hand, you tend to get very scattered kind of approaches and not really a centered approach to how the country should develop as a whole. The other sort of factor that's in an odd way has gotten in the way has been the global economic boom up until this year. So Cambodia had 10+% economic growth every year. So I don't want to say things come easily in Cambodia. On the other hand, when you're starting from nothing, it's relatively easy to generate high levels of growth with the world economy as it was. But then, as you said in the opening, that has sharply been cut off.
Right. So it sounds like we're at different points. So what are the challenges in each country for those who are concerning themselves with development?
Well, let me start with Vietnam. The challenge, the greatest challenge in Vietnam probably has to do with infrastructure. I think when an economy tries to join the developing world, there's a great deal of entrepreneurialism, there's energy, there's tremendous excitement in that country. It reminds me of at least what I read about the Wild West of America. Back in the days when there was great opportunity, but nowhere near the amount of infrastructure that's necessary to make it happen and to support it. And the infrastructure in Vietnam is very much physical. Just the physical needs of better airports, better ports, better roads, better railroads and so forth, but also the social infrastructure is a tremendous challenge there, especially when it comes to education. If you're going to develop your economy like Vietnam wants to, they really need to improve their higher education, really education across the board, and also health, public health, everything from sustainable environmental issues to just having drinking water for all of the citizens to dealing with better hospitals, better trained medical staff, and so forth. And then the third factor I would say that's very important to them is to really nurture and cultivate the small and medium-sized businesses, the entrepreneurial kind of businesses, the startups. Those are the three things I'd focus on.
I think it's very similar stories. I would think in Cambodia as well, where in the 2008 elections, when they polled voters about what was important to how they cast their vote, or the issues that are most important, by far the two top answers to that question were roads and schools. So it's infrastructure and education, again, on the Cambodian side. Again, you're facing this. I think Vietnam obviously lived through the Vietnam War. The Cambodians, after that period, lived through the genocide of the Khmer Rouge period. And the Khmer Rouge deliberately targeted the elite, the educated. They wanted to bring the country back to year zero, literally, and sort of rebuild the mindset of the people. So if you were an educated class, professor or a bureaucrat or a business person, you were targeted. You know, you were lucky if you only got sent to the labor camps, if not killed. So there is that layer that's basically missing in Cambodia, and so there's a strong desire to obviously rebuild that. So that's the interest in education, and on the infrastructure side, it's as simple as, you know, you have to do subsistence farming, even if you could produce a surplus, because you have no place to take it. But once the roads start to go in and people begin to travel, even on a very local level, you get small local markets. Tourism has become a huge industry outside one of the two biggest non-agricultural industries in Cambodia. But again, that's all about airports and ports and hotels and the infrastructure to support those things. So those kinds of investments have been happening, and then there's been less, but more roads going in the rural areas, more schools going in the rural areas. I think those very, very, very basics, which again we would take here for granted, are the starting points for a lot of people in Cambodia. And then I think because so much of Cambodia is engaged in subsistence agriculture, there are things just about small improvements in productivity. So, for example, most grow rice. In the rainy season, which is a little bit less than half the year, you obviously can put in a crop of rice, but in the dry season you can't, unless you can do dry rice cultivation, which involves irrigation, more infrastructure, irrigation, reservoirs, and so on. And very little of the country actually is able to do that type of rice cultivation. So what they get out of their land, the rice per hectare, is half or less of what would be sort of normal for a productive rice field.
Okay. Well, we can pick this up after our break. Right now, we'll take a short break, and to our viewers, we'll see you right back with International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about development in Southeast Asia with Rob Ricigliano and Jeff Browne. Well, I'm wondering if you could give us a little sense of who are the actors in some of these development activities we've been talking about. Jeff, we'll start with you in Vietnam.
Well, the World Bank plays a huge role, the Asian Development Bank, all of the United Nations, all of the large, the usual suspects in terms of the international community is there in full force. There's a very large international community in Hanoi that's deeply involved in development activities. And then there's another layer of companies, governments worldwide that are very much interested in Vietnam, probably because partly of the Vietnam War. Many of the European countries that are very small have a much larger presence, for example, than the United States does in Vietnam, and certainly most of the countries, the developed countries of Asia as well.
I mean, there's sort of three tiers of players. So you have the Western development agencies, the Europeans, the Americans. You have somewhat different type of relationship, though, with the Asian development. So India, Japan, China, government. But the biggest group, or maybe in some ways the most influential, are the private businesses. So the Chinese private interests that are investing in Cambodia, the Koreans, and to some extent the Japanese, who are coming in and taking advantage of the land. I mean, Cambodia's got rich farmland and forests and so on. Also, we're seeing investment by, of all places, the Kuwaitis and the Saudis, because they are, again, they can buy up agricultural rice production land that they ship back to Kuwait, which has, I guess, brings up somewhat of the downside of at least the way the global economic, the impact of the global economic boom has been, which is that Cambodia has been seen as sort of cheap, productive land. So a lot of the development policy, or the lack of development policy, has been that you have a lot of land grabbing, where people who have farmed land for say, decades are sort of kicked off. It becomes now a business enterprise, a Chinese, Korean, or Kuwaiti business enterprise. Local people aren't brought back to farm, and the produce might benefit a few people who facilitated this land concession, but the actual profits of it go back to Kuwait or Korea or China, wherever it is. So the private business interests, I think, in some ways are the most impactful, both on the positive and on the negative side.
So, you know, one of the things you mentioned was the lack of coordination. I mean, is there any overarching governmental body that's really looking after how all of this is playing out? Yeah,
I mean, I want to be clear here. This is my personal view. This is not involved in my mission that I was on. But I think that there hasn't needed to be a sort of government coordinator in that way. I mean, you mentioned key actors. Well, the internal key actor in Cambodia is the Cambodian People's Party, the party of the Prime Minister Hun Sen. He's the longest-serving prime minister in the world. He basically has been in the prime minister's role since Cambodians have been back in charge of their own country. And the CPP has gotten more powerful. The opposition parties have shrunk in the seats they hold in parliament. So they pretty much have a monopoly on access to resources and political power and so on. So that it's been able to work acceptably well for everybody without necessarily an articulated central vision. So it's been enough to have Chinese money coming in. Yes, it takes some resources out, but it's also bringing a lot of resources in. Yes, it has environmental and even human rights impacts that are negative, but it's also maybe leading to more infrastructure. So it hasn't been a terribly well coordinated policy or directed policy, but it kind of fits that very reactive mindset that I think that the Cambodians have been in since the 70s, where they haven't. They really haven't been in charge of their own government in that sense. They've been either supported by the Vietnamese when the Vietnamese came in and kicked the Khmer Rouge out, or it's been in the international community.
Jeff, my sense is that's very different than the Vietnamese model.
It's a bit different. Vietnamese government is very much engaged in all of the economic development of the country. In fact, right after the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese government took the attitude that if we can defeat the Americans, we can do anything. and they took on a very arrogant sort of attitude that said, we can control the economy start to finish. It didn't work. And basically they found that they were having great difficulties just feeding their people. So in the mid-'80s, the government started to back off and allow more of a free enterprise to emerge. And right now the tension, after all these years in Vietnam, is there's a tension between government control, trying to control things and make sure that Vietnam is moving forward in a free enterprise, but also social way of improving the social lives of its people. And at the same time, people and international community, as well as the local domestic community of business at least, saying, leave us alone and we will develop the country. And that tension is, it's very interesting to see that unfold as Vietnam becomes more and more independent and a larger and larger player in the international community.
I think it's interesting that they've been in the driver's seat really since, or at least felt as though they were in the driver's seat since the end of the war, whereas it's been the opposite, I think, in Cambodia, where I don't think the Cambodians have felt as though they were in the driver's seat in all this. And it also goes back to another level of key player, which in Cambodia anyway is sort of Vietnam and Thailand. I mean,
well, that's something I wanted to get into a bit. You know, you've referenced sort of the relationship between the two countries. What are the sort of intra-regional dynamics?
It's complex. I mean, historically, the Cambodian perception is that it's between two powerful sort of bookends that are kind of squishing the book in the middle. You've got Vietnam on one side and Thailand on the other side, two much bigger countries, much bigger populations, and that Cambodia sort of sees itself as the victim of the whims of the two. So in some ways, you know, Vietnam or Thailand gets scapegoated for a lot of what's happening in Cambodia, although a lot of that it feels like it's much more perception than reality. I mean, there is truth to it, I'm sure. There's a lot of integration, there's a lot of economic migration from Cambodia into Vietnam and Thailand and vice versa. There's obviously deep cultural ties between them, and the Buddhists in Thailand I think are more similar to the Buddhists in Cambodia as opposed to the ones in Vietnam. There are ethnic groups that have crossed the borders. So it's a very long-term, obviously, and complex cultural, social, political, economic relationship, and I'm sure it's the mirror, perhaps, and the Vietnamese will mirror the Cambodian perceptions of them, but it really defies, I think, sort of simple platitudes like, oh, it's all the Vietnamese fault or it's all the Thais' fault.
Yeah, you capture the complexity very well, but there's a great deal of energy in that entire region toward cooperation, collaboration. They're talking a lot about things like visa-free zones where you can travel, free among countries without going through a lot of bureaucracy. And I think that there's an understanding internally within Southeast Asia and the ASEAN nations that if they work more and more together, they are going to emerge as an economic powerhouse as a region.
Yeah, I think it's very much that feeling in Cambodia as well, that the ASEAN, being more active in ASEAN is definitely on the agenda of the Cambodians. And there have been really relatively recently an uptick in higher level Vietnamese government visits to Cambodia as well. So right now the Cambodians have this kind of love-hate relationship with Vietnam. On the other hand, I think from a practical sense, they realize that they're very intertwined. Certainly economically. Thailand right now, somewhat of a different issue because they've had a couple of border skirmishes over one of the major temples, which is on the. There's several on the border, but one in the north of Cambodia on the Thai border has kind of played a little bit into the internal politics in Thailand, which are very unstable right now, and that's been used somewhat internally in Thailand as a point of national pride. But it's really soured relationships between Thailand and Cambodia, though.
Well, as usual, we're fast running out of time. We've got less than 2 minutes to go. So I'm wondering if each of you could put a hat on as advisor to the government, and just in terms of development policy, what in your experience has been working? What should they do more of? What perhaps isn't working?
The first thing that the United States needs to realize is that it is really behind the game in Vietnam, largely because of, I think, some anxiety about how we might be perceived in that country after our behavior during that war. And I would say that it's in the United States' interest to jump in with both feet in Vietnam, the way Germany is there, and Korea and Australia and all these other countries that are really taking a great interest in Vietnam. United States of America should too, because Vietnam is in fact one of the largest countries in the world and is one of the fastest growing countries in the world.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar for Cambodia as well. I think that it is a U.S.-Cambodian relationship has actually changed and improved a lot. There's been a bit of a standoffish relationship. They've begun to re-engage. I think that's been very productive. The big thing for the government, though, in Cambodia is realizing that the formula or the mechanism that got them where they are is not going to be what's going to happen going forward. That with this global economic change, they actually do need to think seriously about a different model, and it's a very big point of maturation, I think, for the government, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Rob Ricigliano, Jeff Browne, thank you very much to our viewers. We'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,